Since the brutal dictatorship of Marcos Sr., the same man who through his martial law unleashed a Holocaust on the Filipino people with more than 3,000 documented extrajudicial killings and 35,000 cases of torture targeting students, journalists, farmers, priests, and indigenous communities, the Philippines was driven into a debt trap, forced into structural adjustments by puppets of the US like the IMF and World Bank, basically selling a whole nation's sovereignty. This legacy paved the way for the 1995 oil deregulation laws under Ramos, which handed over the country's energy lifeline to foreign cartels such as Shell, Caltex, and Petron. Just last month, the US was the first country to declare a national energy emergency with only enough oil left for 45 days. The Philippines currently imports 98% of its oil from the Gulf. Since the US bombed Iran, local diesel and petrol prices have more than doubled. While the world trembles at the threat of attacks on energy infrastructure, companies like Petron and Shell are raking in an extra 536 million pesos in daily profits by hiking prices far beyond global benchmarks.
Shame!
By refusing to repeal the oil deregulation law, the Philippine government cashes in by pocketing 63 million pesos to while the Filipino families starve thanks to the 12% value-added tax applied to these already extortionate prices. While some Singaporeans grumble and sit uncomfortably as their Grab prices slowly rise and their lavish vacations are delayed, Filipinos are bled dry by the actions of the US.
Shame!
When the Philippine government offers a 5,000 peso handout, this is equivalent to 100 Singapore dollars, calling it aid to jeepney drivers, it is just a drop in an ocean of loss. Sound familiar? Much like how we are here offered CDC vouchers and tax rebates that fail to reflect the true crushing weight of inflation and told how we should feel grateful for this.
Shame!
The reach of US imperialism isn't just in the gas tank, but takes so many shapes and forms since the US purchased the entire Philippines from Spain for $20 million in 1898. US imperialism extends to our classrooms, our pop culture, the mines that destroy our ecosystem, the grabbing of ancestral lands, and the US military bases that take over community life and hold our people hostage on their own land. Economically, US imperialism is enforced through neoliberal policies that prevent the Philippines from developing a genuine national industrial foundation. To this day, US imperialism purposely preserves domestic feudalism, stunting our agricultural development so severely that peasant masses are kept in bondage, forced to rely on the simple agricultural implements and grueling physical labor reminiscent of the Stone Ages. Instead, the country is relegated to a floating economy of low value-added export manufacturing and raw material extraction. Because of this colonial pattern of trade, the Philippine market is completely colonized by American and other Western products. Filipinos are forced to pay exorbitant prices, consistently jacked up prices for imported finished goods, while everything produced locally is exported at dirt cheap prices to feed foreign monopolies, rather than being used to meet the people's domestic needs.
Whoa!
This unequal exchange traps the Philippines in a cycle of foreign debt and chronic trade deficits, forcing 10% of its population to work abroad due to the lack of domestic industry. So when some of the 10% of Filipinos arrive here in Singapore, how do we treat them? Migrant domestic workers here are subject to predatory recruitment and arrive carrying debts of up to $15,000. This is a sum of more than 700,000 pesos that could have sustained a family of 5 living in poverty for months. When Singapore claims no legal jurisdiction over fees charged in home countries, we are essentially allowing our neighbors to remain trapped in debt bondage for the first 8 months of their job here. How can we claim to be a developed nation when our comfort is built on migrant debt?
Shame!
Migrant domestic workers in Singapore, not just the Filipinos, are also subject to employers who manipulate their pay slips. They are excluded from Part 4 of the Employment Act, where migrant domestic workers do not have a statutory right to overtime pay. They have zero privacy in their employers' homes. They don't have dedicated meal breaks or downtime, and they are often worked to exhaustion. Growing up in Singapore, my family being part of those 10% of Filipinos, I, like many of the other Filipino children, have been told to be grateful. But today I ask something more potent than gratitude, which is your solidarity.
Wow!
Looking at the coalitions of jeepney drivers, labor unions, and students in the Philippines who have historically made governments reverse price hikes, even while under military threat, their movements are a blueprint for our own courage. Their struggle against neoliberal, extractivist, and intentionally exploitative policies is our struggle, and their fight for national industrialization is a regional answer to a century of US-led violence. Let us also not forget the international struggle for better rights for our migrant workers, stemming from the story of Flor Contemplacion, who, on our soil, was a migrant caregiver wrongfully convicted and executed. Flor was born in 1956 to a peasant fisherfolk family. Growing up poor, she was in and out of elementary school and finished at 15 years old. She left the Philippines to work here in Singapore to support her children after she and her husband separated. On May 4, 1991, Flor visited her friend Delia Maga, another domestic worker and babysitter for a 4-year-old boy who dealt with seizures. Delia was scheduled to go back to the Philippines, and Flor had brought items for Delia's children. While they spoke, the boy had a seizure in the bathroom and drowned, while Delia, who called the boy's father to come home, was beaten and strangled to death while Flor watched in terror. Flor fled the house but was soon arrested for the alleged murder of both Delia and the child. Flor was then transferred to Changi Prison, where she was visited by the Consul General of the Philippine Embassy, who convinced Flor to plead guilty on reason of insanity. Trusting them, Flor followed the advice. While in prison, Flor faced abuse and torture. Flor was sentenced to death and hanged on March 17, 1995, despite the efforts from Philippine organizations in the homeland and an empty promise of action from the then President, Fidel V. Ramos. Because of this, and in response to the suffering perpetuated by the corrupt government that continues to sell out Filipino people for profit, Migrante, comprising grassroots organizations all over the world, dedicated to defending and promoting the rights and welfare of Filipino migrant workers and their families, was formed a year later. To my fellow Filipinos raised here in the comfort of Singapore, it is not our fault that we are made to feel lucky, indebted, or subservient to the imperialist force that benefits from our labor, our parents' labor, and the labor of millions of other Filipinos back home. Reclaiming the words utang na loob, not as debt, but profound solidarity, we can see more clearly the histories, struggles, and kinship that bind us to our home community and our home country. If you have been raised in Singapore, utang na loob is a struggle that has birthed you. It calls on us to retain the ties we have with the homeland and to see the liberation of Filipino people as our destination. I would like to honor the 1 million Filipinos who leave their families, their barangays, their communities every year, Filipinos who are forced to flee the oppression of bureaucrat capitalism and feudalism, Filipinos who make sure their families and communities in so many parts of the world, including here in Singapore, are cared for, while we are separated from our own kin. Shame on the Philippine government's continued subservience to US imperialism.
Shame!
These are the root causes that create the conditions for Filipino women and mothers to experience violence and exploitation abroad. Overthrowing this rotten system and generations of exploitation is necessary for us to free future generations of Filipino workers to build our own industries, communities, and nation. Thank you.
Wow!
Okay, so I think you've noticed that on your